At 6:12 on a Monday morning, a forklift lifted 31 field bins of tomatoes over the side of a waste trailer. 34,000 pounds, red, ripe, split by heat. The packing house saw a disposal bill. 20-year-old Elena Navarro stood behind the chain-link fence with a grease pencil and wrote one number on the back of a shipping tag. 13,600 jars. That was the difference. The men on the loading dock were counting what the tomatoes could no longer be. Elena was counting what they could become. The farm belonged to Elena's family, though belonged was not the word her father used. Miguel Navarro said land was something you answered to. 74 acres of processing tomatoes, peppers, and winter greens in Red Mesa County, California. His parents had leased the first 12 acres in 1987. Miguel had spent 3 decades adding ground one careful parcel at a time. He knew irrigation pressure by sound. He could spot whitefly damage from the cab of a pickup. He could tell whether a field crew was falling behind by the way the harvest trailers lined up at noon. And every August, he watched the same thing happen. A heat wave would push the tomatoes too fast. Skins would split, shoulders would sunburn. Fruit that tasted exactly like the rest would fail the packing house's appearance grade. Sierra Bend Packing paid 4 cents a pound for those rejects when it paid anything at all. Some loads went to livestock feed, some went to compost, some went into a steel trailer and left the property under a waste manifest. Miguel called it shrink, Elena called it inventory. She had started keeping records at 17, not romantic records, not journal entries about saving the farm. Weights, sugar readings, reject percentages, disposal fees, retail prices, processing yields, labor minutes per case. By the time she came home from her second year at Central Valley State, she had a spreadsheet showing that the Navarro farm had lost the usable value of more than 100,000 pounds of tomatoes in 4 seasons. The fruit was not unsafe when it came off the vine. It was simply too soft, too split, or too irregular to survive the packing line and a week under grocery store lights. That distinction mattered. Because a tomato that could not sit in a produce display for 7 days could still become sauce within 7 hours. Elena had spent a semester studying small-batch food processing with Dr. Leah Kim, a food systems economist who had built her career around one blunt question. What happens when a farm stops selling only what a distributor is willing to recognize? Dr. Kim had shown her case studies from olive growers, berry farms, dairies, and orchards. The strongest operations did not eliminate waste. They designed a second business around it. Elena came home with a process plan for slow-roasted tomato passata, a cost model, and a sample label she had printed at the campus library. She placed all 3 beside her father's coffee cup. Miguel read the first page without touching the second. He asked about permits. She had a list. He asked about acidity controls. She showed him the scheduled process she had arranged to have reviewed. He asked about liability. She showed him the insurance quote. Then he asked the question that mattered most. Who is going to buy sauce made from tomatoes the packing house rejected? Elena did not say everyone. She did not say people care about waste. She said, I need 480 customers to find out. Miguel looked toward the window. The wash shed sat beyond the equipment yard, unused except for old drip tape and a broken sorting table. He told her she could have 1,200 pounds from the next reject load. 1 batch. No money from the operating account. No disruption to harvest. If the county did not approve the room, the experiment ended. If the product did not sell, the experiment ended. If Sierra Bend objected, the experiment ended. Elena said yes before he could add another condition. For the next 19 days, she cleaned a building nobody had properly cleaned in years. She sealed the floor, replaced a sink, installed washable wall panels, bought a used pulper from a school cafeteria auction, and a steam-jacketed kettle from a restaurant that had closed outside Fresno. Her mother, Rosa, painted the trim. Miguel did not help. But on the 9th evening, Elena found a new stainless hose fitting on the workbench with no note attached. She installed it without mentioning it. The first batch began before sunrise. Elena and Rosa sorted every tomato by hand. Anything with mold, fermentation, or broken flesh went out. Sound fruit with split skins stayed. The room filled with the smell of hot tomato, garlic, and roasted pepper. The pulper shook so hard at full speed that Elena had to wedge a folded feed sack beneath one leg. At 2:40 in the morning, they sealed jar number 486. Elena slept for 90 minutes, loaded the cases into the farm truck, and set up a folding table at the Saturday market under a banner that read Open Row Foods. She priced each jar at $9. Miguel told her the price was too high. Rosa told him to let the market answer. The market answered in 4 hours. By noon, the table was empty. By 1, Elena had 37 names on a pre-order sheet. By the end of the weekend, 2 restaurant owners had left messages. 1,200 pounds of reject tomatoes would have brought the farm $48 at the packing house. The finished batch produced more than $4,000 in sales. After jars, ingredients, market fees, fuel, permits, and the actual cost of the fruit, Elena cleared a little over $2,000. It was not enough to transform the farm. It was enough to make dismissal expensive. Miguel studied the numbers at the kitchen table. He checked her jar count against the invoice book. Then he checked it again. Finally, he said, "One batch is not a season," Elena said. "No. But it is not $48 either." He gave her the rejects from 8 acres. That should have been the beginning of the easy part. It was not. The farm's contract ran through Sierra Bend Packing, and Sierra Bend was run by Grant Mercer, a 58-year-old operator, who had spent 26 years building relationships with growers, trucking companies, and regional grocery buyers. Grant was not careless. He was not stupid, and he was not cruel. He was dangerous in a quieter way. He had been right for so long that he had started treating his experience as a law of nature. Sierra Bend graded produce. Good fruit moved forward, bad fruit moved sideways. That was how the business stayed efficient. Elena asked to meet him at the county growers' breakfast in November. She brought invoices, batch records, and the pre-order list. Grant listened while she explained the pilot. He nodded at the right places. Then he smiled. It was the practiced smile of a man who wanted to end a conversation without making an enemy. He told her farmers market customers loved a story. He told her restaurant chefs were always chasing something local until the next thing came along. He told her a few jars sold under a canvas tent did not change the economics of commercial agriculture. Then he tapped the invoice page with one finger and said, "You can sell almost anything once." A seed dealer at the table laughed into his coffee. Not loudly, just enough. Elena looked at Grant. She said, 41% of the first buyers reordered before I had another batch. The seed dealer stopped laughing. Grant said repeat orders were encouraging. He said scale would be the real test. Elena closed the folder. "Then I'll bring you scale." The next season, Miguel gave her the reject stream from 22 acres. Elena financed a larger pulper with a small equipment loan. She added a second kettle, a labeling machine, and enough cold storage to hold 3 days of fruit. She hired 2 local women who had worked harvest crews for years and knew how to sort faster than any machine she could afford. She wrote batch codes on every case. She calibrated the pH meter twice a day. She tracked the temperature of every cook, the seal on every jar, and the time between harvest and processing. Grant had called it a market test. Elena treated it like a manufacturing system. By mid-July, Open Row Foods was supplying 6 restaurants, 2 independent grocers, and a farm store cooperative. Then the heat arrived. For 9 days. Afternoon temperatures stayed above 105. The tomatoes did what tomatoes do when heat forces them faster than the plant can carry them. They ripened all at once. On Wednesday morning, the field manager estimated 12,000 pounds of split fruit would need to be harvested before Friday night. Elena's room could process 6,000. She called the restaurants and moved their delivery dates. She rented a refrigerated trailer. She booked overflow hours at a shared-use kitchen 62 miles away. She added a night shift. Every part of the plan was expensive. Every part of it was still cheaper than letting the fruit collapse in the field. By sunset, the first bins reached the wash shed. At 11:18 that night, the drive motor on the large pulper failed. For 1 second, nobody moved. The kettle hissed. Water ran over the sorting table. Outside, another trailer backed toward the door. Elena opened the motor housing and smelled burned insulation. The replacement part was 2 days away. The tomatoes had less than 1. That was the first moment the project stopped feeling like an argument and started feeling like a risk. The equipment loan payment was due in 9 days. 2 grocery orders were already labeled. The rented trailer was costing money by the hour. And in the field, red fruit was softening under the dark. Miguel came into the shed just after midnight. He looked at the dead pulper, then at the stacked bins. He told Elena they could call Sierra Bend in the morning and take the salvage rate. It would hurt, but the farm would survive it. He said there was no shame in learning the limit of a small operation. Elena heard what he was trying to give her, a way out that still sounded respectable. She also heard the old calculation returning, 4 cents a pound. Write it down. Move on, she said. The machine failed, the model didn't. Miguel rubbed both hands over his face. What do you need? That was the first time he asked her that question. Not whether the idea would work. Not whether she was sure. What do you need? Elena needed trucks. She needed ice. She needed every usable hotel pan in the county kitchen. And she needed a way to separate the tomatoes fast enough that the best fruit reached the overflow kitchen before dawn. Miguel called the crew. Rosa called the kitchen manager. One of Elena's workers called her brother, who drove refrigerated freight at night. By 2:10, the wash shed had become a relay station. Sound split fruit went into chilled totes. Soft but usable fruit went directly to the smaller pulper. Anything questionable went out. No heroic shortcuts. No pretending every tomato could be saved. Just decisions, repeated quickly and correctly. At 4:30 in the morning, the first refrigerated truck left for the shared kitchen. At 7, Elena drove behind it with the process logs on the passenger seat. They worked 31 hours. The overflow kitchen charged overtime. The emergency freight erased most of the margin on that load, and 180 cases missed their original delivery window. But the fruit was processed safely. The grocers kept their orders. The restaurants reordered. And when the replacement motor arrived on Friday, Miguel installed it himself. He did not leave the fitting on a workbench this time. He stayed until the machine ran. The crisis should have ended there. Instead, 3 weeks later, a routine records review found that one employee had copied the wrong calibration time onto a batch sheet. The food was within specification. The seals were sound. The test results were clean. But the record was not. Elena placed 640 jars on hold. She could have argued that the error was clerical. She could have released them and hoped no one looked closer. She destroyed the lot. It cost nearly $14,000 in product and labor. Grant heard about it before the week was over. At the next grower's breakfast, he told Miguel that this was what he had meant when he said processing was more complicated than it looked. Miguel glanced at Elena. She was standing at the end of the counter with a paper cup of coffee. Before she could answer, he said, she found the problem herself. Grant said that did not change the loss. Miguel said, no. It changes whether I trust the next batch. Elena did not smile. But she remembered the sentence. The season closed in October. She processed 38,400 pounds of tomatoes that Sierra Bend would not have accepted as fresh market fruit. Open Row Foods generated just under $148,000 in gross sales. After labor, ingredients, packaging, freight, kitchen rental, loan costs, permits, and the destroyed lot, the operation produced a little more than $76,000 in operating income. At the salvage rate, the same tomatoes would have brought the farm about $1,500, not $76,000. $1,500. Elena placed the final statement in front of Miguel at the kitchen table. He read it silently. Rosa stood at the counter, drying the same plate for much longer than necessary. Miguel looked at the operating income, then at the loss from the destroyed lot, then at the wholesale reorder rate. He asked how much volume the current room could handle. Elena told him. He asked what it would cost to double it. She turned to the next page. He looked at her, then at the spreadsheet. You already priced it. I priced 3 versions. For the first time, Miguel laughed, not at her, with relief. He chose the middle version. The following February, Elena was invited to present at the state's specialty crop conference. She was 22 and the youngest person on the processing panel. Grant Mercer sat 4 rows from the front. Elena did not tell the room that waste was bad. She did not tell them young people understood the future better than old people. She showed them the actual mechanism. Fresh market grading measured appearance and shelf life. Processing value depended on flavor, solids, speed, safety, and what the buyer wanted the ingredient to become. Those were different systems measuring different things. A packing line could correctly reject a tomato for one market and still be completely wrong about its value in another. She showed the 4-cent salvage number. She showed the $9 jar. She showed the cost of emergency freight. She showed the destroyed lot. She showed the $76,000 operating result. The room went quiet in the way rooms go quiet when people are not merely listening. They are recalculating. After the panel, growers surrounded Elena near the hallway coffee urn. They asked about equipment, process reviews, labor, insurance, and whether she would share her batch log template. Grant waited until the crowd thinned. He held a folded conference program in one hand. He told her the presentation was strong. Elena thanked him. He said Sierra Bend expected to reject nearly 200 tons of tomatoes across its grower network that summer. He asked whether Open Row Foods could take some of that volume. Elena looked at him for a moment. 2 years earlier, he had said she could sell almost anything once. Now he was asking for capacity. She could have made him repeat the apology hidden inside the question. She did not. She asked about harvest timing, field separation, transport temperature, and who would own the fruit before processing. Grant answered each question. Then he said, I was too quick to decide what this was. Elena said, you decided what the tomatoes were worth in the only market you were measuring. Grant nodded. That sounds better than what I was going to say. It's also the problem. They built a pilot agreement for 3 growers, not charity, not a sustainability campaign, a supply contract. Fruit had to meet safety specifications. Loads had to be traceable. Open Row paid more than salvage and less than fresh market grade. The growers recovered value. Sierra Bend reduced disposal. Elena gained raw material without carrying the cost of growing every pound herself. The second business did not replace the first. It exposed what the first business had been leaving behind. By 2025, Open Row Foods operated from a converted equipment barn with 2 processing lines and a tasting counter open on weekends. The company employed 7 people during peak season and 3 year-round. Its sauce, roasted tomato base, and pepper tomato conserve were sold through 23 stores and a regional restaurant distributor. Across fresh sales, processing, and wholesale ingredients, the Navarro farm's revenue per planted acre had risen by 178% from the year before Elena's first batch. Miguel still grew tomatoes the same careful way. He still checked irrigation pressure by sound. He still disliked debt. He still believed a field should earn the right to be replanted. But he no longer called the reject stream shrink. He called it the second harvest. Grant changed Sierra Bend's grading policy. Fruit that failed fresh market standards was no longer automatically treated as waste. It was sorted into feed, compost, or process-grade channels based on condition and timing. The change was not dramatic from the road. No ribbon cutting, no magazine cover. Just fewer trailers leaving full of usable food. The seed dealer who had laughed at the breakfast became one of Open Row's pepper suppliers. He never mentioned the laugh. Elena never asked him to. The strongest proof was not that people admitted she had been right. It was that they began budgeting around the thing they had once dismissed. One evening in the spring of 2026, Elena's younger brother Mateo came into the kitchen carrying a binder. He was 19. He had been studying the piles of pepper stems, skins, and seeds left after processing. He had found a buyer for dried pepper seed and had been testing whether the remaining material could become a shelf-stable seasoning base. He had yield numbers, equipment quotes, a contamination control plan, and the tense expression of someone preparing to be told that an idea was too small, too strange, or too early. He placed the binder beside Elena's coffee. Miguel was at the sink. Rosa was cutting limes. For a second, the kitchen looked almost exactly as it had 6 years earlier, when Elena placed her first label beside her father's cup. Mateo began explaining. Elena stopped him. Not because the idea was weak, because she knew the first question mattered. What do you need to test it? Mateo looked at her. Then he opened the binder. Miguel turned from the sink and pulled out a chair. 34,000 pounds of tomatoes had once disappeared into a waste trailer because they failed a test they were never meant to pass. Elena did not prove the packing house was useless. She proved its answer was incomplete. A grade can decide where a crop is allowed to go. It cannot decide what that crop is capable of becoming.